All right, well, we are going to turn our attention to Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. The first couple of chapters we looked at leading up to chapter 3, verse number 6, was kind of introduction to the book of Judges. Chapter 2 especially shows us what we call the Judges cycle. We've talked about that the past couple of weeks. And the Judges cycle is this pattern that the Israelites lived in for several hundred years during the time of the Judges, where it would be marked with unfaithfulness to God, that they would turn from God, they would serve other gods. Therefore, God would be angry. God would send their neighboring enemies to conquer them and to subdue them for a number of years. Within that, they would cry out to God, and God would hear them, be merciful to them, and would raise up a judge. And a judge in the book of Judges is a deliverer God raises up, empowers to defeat Israel's enemies. So God would raise up a judge. The people would serve God during the time of that judge. But then when the judge would die, the people would go back to in their sinful ways. They would turn their back on God again, and thus it repeats the cycle. And we see that over and over again. So starting with chapter 3 and verse 7, and going through the majority of the book, we see this played out in detail with each one of these judges. So we're going to look at the first 4 judges that the scripture here mentions, and that would be Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and then Deborah and Barak. And we're going to see their stories as we look through chapters 3 all the way through chapter 5. So our introduction today, the central section of the Judges contains the accounts of Israel's judges and shapes the overall shape of 3 through 16 is the same as the summary that we just mentioned, this Judges cycle. However, it just paints it in a more detailed way, telling the stories, going through the processes of decline which happens, and then the raising up of the judges and the defeat of their enemies. So we find out much about the territory and the land of Israel. If you're a geography and history person, the book of Judges is a great book for you because it lists the areas around Israel, the tribes around Israel, their kings, how long they ruled. So there's a lot of specifics that we find here in the book of Judges. But as we come to our first judge in chapter 3, verse number 7 through verse number 11, we find his name is Othniel. And Othniel is kind of an exemplary judge. He's linked back to the Joshua era because Othniel comes from the family of Caleb. If you remember, Caleb and Joshua were the 2 spies who came back from the land of Canaan with a good report, and they were the only 2 from that generation that were allowed to go into the promised land. So Othniel is linked to Caleb and linked back to Joshua's generation. When he defeats the enemy that rises up against Israel, the land has rest for 40 years. And we know that number 40 carries significant connotation. The Israelites wandered in the land for 40 years. There's just so many parallels that we find there. So you almost get the sense that Othniel could be a person of hope, carrying on from the generation of faith, in Joshua's generation being related to Caleb, giving the land rest for 40 years. So hey, maybe he's going to be this next Joshua. Maybe he's going to lead the people to faithfulness, but yet what we see continuing on is the judges' cycle. That Israel, even after Othniel's death, they turn right back around to faithlessness in God. So Othniel, son of Kenaz, is linked to the tribe of Judah. He's a relative of Caleb. He's raised up to defeat Cushan, the king of Mesopotamia, which one commentator describes as one of the most exotic and distant of Israel's enemies of the period outside of the land of Canaan. The king of Mesopotamia briefly has reign over the nation of Israel, or the tribes of Israel, for about 8 years. Is the time that Cushan establishes himself as oppression of the Israelites. The biblical account states, it does not state which tribes were involved, and it does not state how Othniel defeated Cushan. The initial judge cycle is fully represented here as we will read. The sin, the anger, the oppression, the deliverer. So all of the details and all of the elements of the judge's cycle we find here in verses 7 through 11. One thing you'll notice about this account is it carries a pretty positive tone about the defeat of this king. And it's pretty short, simple, and to the point. It lacks a lot of the details that we'll see, especially when we get into the judge Ehud, and especially Deborah and Barak. It doesn't tell us how Othniel achieved victory. It's pretty simple, leading a lot of people to believe that this Othniel judge really just gives the formula for what's going to happen later, because it's so short, it's so distinct, it's got all of the elements in there, and it's a story of Othniel's success, which forms a realm of hope, but yet we see that hope is quickly distinguished only to go back into the cycle. We do know the source of Othniel's victory, though. The source of Othniel's victory is in verse number 11. When the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, the Lord gave Cushan into his hand. So the secret to Othniel's victory was the Lord was with him, and the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. And again, that wording of the Spirit of the Lord, to me, just invokes the pictures back of Joshua and Caleb, and how the Spirit of the Lord was upon them. So Othniel's victory is ultimately God's victory for Israel. And then, of course, he gives the land rest for 40 years. But then when Othniel died, the cycle begins all over again. So since this is such a short account, let's go to our scriptures and let's read the account here in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. It says, "The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God. They served the Baals and Ashtaroth. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan for 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother." So the son of Kenaz. So Othniel was essentially kind of like a nephew of Caleb. Verse 10, "The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan, the king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan, and so the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died." So you see, this is pretty straightforward. This is to the point. There's not a story to tell, really. There's no details to decipher. It's the people sinned. They forgot the Lord. The Lord was angry. He raised up a king, a foreign king, to oppress them. They cried out. God raised up a deliverer. The deliverer defeated the king. The land had rest. And then the judge died. So pretty simple and to the point. So Othniel is, the first to lead off of the judges, where we simply see what happens here in the land. Now when we come to the second judge, Ehud, in chapters 3, verses 12 through 30, obviously we get a longer story. And Ehud, the story of Ehud is pretty interesting to say the least. If not interesting, it's actually very humorous. This is a very humorous story. And it would probably be very hilarious to Israelites who are reading this account after the fact, for there is a lot of humor in here, some ironies, some crude humor, actually, some toilet humor, literally toilet humor that we find here. And it's just one of these things that, when you read it, it's hard to take it that seriously because, it's just such an interesting read when you have Ehud raising up to be judge. So we're going to go through some of this. In fact, I want to read some of this too because this is just so interesting to read. So in verse number 12, let's just start reading in the scripture first. Verse number 12, after Othniel died, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab. All right, so we had a Mesopotamian king. Now we have Eglon, the king of Moab. He strengthened Eglon against Moab, or Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites, the Amalekites, and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms, and the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Garra, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now, first of all, he just has to point out a left-handed man. Here's where the irony starts in. The irony is Ehud is left-handed, but he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin literally means the son of the right hand. So you have a left-handed man from the son of the right hand that God has raised up to defeat Eglon, the king of Moab. So already you have almost kind of a contradiction there, a left-handed man from the right-handed tribe, which could honestly be seen as kind of a slight to Ehud. That he was a deliverer, but this is who you get. You're going to get a left-handed man from the right-handed tribe, and that's who God's going to raise up to give you victory. That in itself has a level of irony and humor in it that he's described as this left-handed man from the right-handed tribe. So the people of Israel sent tribute by Ehud to Eglon, the king of Moab. So they're sending tribute, they're sending money, alms to this king to honor him. Ehud made for himself a sword of 2 edges, a cubit in length, and bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. He presented the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now here's an interesting fact about the king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. All right, so we have a left-handed man from the right-handed tribe sneaking a sword into the very fat king of Moab, which that in itself would have been an insult if to the Moabites, by Israel, writing that their king was a very fat man. He'll end up being a very dumb man and a very embarrassed man by the time this is over. So even in the writing, this being preserved by Israelites, is a slight to all the Moabites, basically making fun of them. So you can't let this just get past you. I mean, this is just kind of and how he's defeated, how the whole army here is defeated. It just carries a level of humor. So Eglon was a very fat man, and when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away all the people who carried the tribute, but he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." And he commanded silence. And all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came in as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." And he arose from his seat. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade. So this dagger was trapped in his belly, for he did not pull out the sword out of his belly. And the dung came out. So he immediately used the bathroom on himself when this happens. And they're in this cool roof chamber, this place up near the roof of his palace. And Ehud goes out into the porch, closes the doors of the roof chamber behind him, and locks the doors. So now Eglon, this very fat king with a sword in his belly that had used the bathroom on himself, is locked in the cool roof chamber. And Ehud escapes. When he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw the doors of the roof were locked, they thought, surely he is relieving himself. He's locked in this room, and there's the smell of him using the bathroom, so they think he's just in there using the bathroom. Obviously, they've smelled that smell before to think, hey, I told you it's very crude humor, but it's what's here. So they say he's relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. So they waited till they were embarrassed for him that was taking him so long. But when he still did not open the doors of the chamber, they took the key, they opened the door, and there lay their Lord dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they were delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country. He was their leader. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. They went down after him, seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, did not allow anyone to pass over. They killed about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men, not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. So a very ironic beginning to the story, a very unlikely, ironic leader, a very not well spoken of king of Moab, a deceptive way that Ehud gains the victory, an embarrassing way for the king to go out, and then a very embarrassing defeat, a total defeat of 10,000 of the Moabites. So all of that would have not been a story that the Moabites would want passed around about them. So you can see how the interesting details make this for a pretty interesting story. So that's what we have here. And the land rests for double the time that it did under Othniel. It rests for 80 years as well. So that's the story of Ehud, the left-handed man from the right-handed tribe who defeats the very fat king by locking him in his bathroom, embarrassing him on the way out. So that's the second judge that we find. The third judge that we find literally has one verse written about him. But yet even he carries a level of mystery and intrigue. And that would be verse number 31 of Judges chapter 4. And this is Shamgar. Shamgar. Here's what chapter 3, verse 31 says about Shamgar. After Ehud died, was Shamgar the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. So that's all we have about him. Missing are, the elements of the judges' cycle that we see, even though it can be implied because Israel needed saving. So it's implied here the same judges' cycle happened. We don't hear about the specific Philistine. We have no king that's involved. We have Shamgar killing 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He saved Israel. So obviously there was some kind of battle. But here's some interesting facts about Shamgar, the son of Anath. It's extremely brief. He's also mentioned in chapter 5 and verse number 6 when in the Song of Deborah, where it talks about in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath. The interesting thing about Shamgar is that his name is not an Israelite name. There's no record of Shamgars who are Israelites. So his name is a non-Israelite name. So to conclude, many scholars conclude that Shamgar wasn't even an Israelite. And may have not even realized that he was fighting on behalf of Israel, but because of his defeat of the Philistines, he saves Israel and is recorded as a deliverer of Israel. And we're brought this way through some archaeology and through linguistics, because his name is not a Israelite name. It's really a Canaanite name. So possibly he could have been a Canaanite, which hated the Philistines and fought the Philistines, which ironically, a Canaanite defeating the Philistines saves Israel, when a Canaanite would never do that. But because of his name is interesting. And then the characterization that he's a son or the son of Anath. Now there was a location that was Anath in the land of Canaan. But Anath was the name of a Canaanite goddess. So Anath was the name of a Canaanite goddess. She was the chosen goddess of a band of warriors in the land of Canaan. Archaeologists discovered between the 1960s and the 1980s, they discovered a large collection in those 20 years of arrowheads from dating back in the very ancient time. And they had names of gods and goddesses written on them, to show that there were people that were fighting with arrowheads. They were fighting in the name of their god or goddesses. Well, some of the arrowheads that they discovered had a name on it that could not be read, but after the name, it was the name of someone, the son of Anath, or son of Anath. So scholars began to look at Shamgar here in a different light, because of the archaeologist's discovery of the son of Anath being written on an arrowhead. So we know that there was a Canaanite band of warriors, probably not even an official band, just probably just a warrior gang during that time, that was fighting on behalf of their chosen goddess, Anath. So it is a possibility. We don't know, because Scripture doesn't tell us, and we don't know for sure, but there is evidence to indicate that possibly Shamgar, because of his name being a non-Israelite name, and because of this characterization of the son of Anath, and Anath being named after a Canaanite goddess, and with the discovery of these arrowheads, that he could have been a part of a Canaanite warrior group who obviously would have went at war with the surrounding nations, and the Philistines being one of those. If that's the case, then that brings another level of interest to this one little verse here in the book of Judges. And showing who and how God raised up people during this time. Because as we've said, none of these judges are morally exemplary. Othniel, his lineage goes back to Caleb. Ehud, we already saw the irony of a left-handed man from a right-handed tribe. We don't hear anything about his spirituality. And then Shamgar, he could have been a Canaanite from a Canaanite warrior group that fought in the name of Anath, a Canaanite goddess, who delivered Israel by killing their enemies and setting them free. So God uses a lot of different types of people here as well. But the four things we do know about Shamgar: he followed Ehud. He's characterized as the son of Anath. He killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and that he saved Israel. And of course, an ox goad is a strong stick that you would prod the oxen along with who were slow. Just kind of stick them a little bit and prod them along. An amazing accomplishment for him to kill 600 men. On the back page, just an interesting note that God's instruments of deliverance were interesting. Shamgar's ox goad, along with Ehud's dagger that he made. In our next judge, we'll see Jael's hammer, Gideon's horns and torches, a woman's millstone, Samson's jawbone, the donkey's jawbone. So there was a lot of interesting ways that these judges gained victory as well. So our first three judges are pretty interesting. Now we come to our next judges in Deborah and Barak. And there are two sections here with Deborah and Barak. One is their story in chapter 4 of what happens. And then in chapter 5, we have the Song of Deborah, which is a song of victory for what has just happened. So Deborah is described as a prophetess, which is interesting because we're not elaborated on how she became a prophetess, what she prophesied, who she was a prophetess to. We're just told in verse number 4, Deborah was a prophetess, and she was judging Israel. So Deborah was a prophetess, and she judged the people of Israel, and she plays the closest role of what we would consider a judge. For it mentions here in verse number 5 that the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. So she plays more of a role of what we would consider a judge than the other judges. So Deborah is described as a prophetess, and a prophetess would have been somebody who hears from God and who speaks the word of God. So that would be her role as a prophetess, even though her specific roles and her specific words that she prophesied, we don't know. But Deborah is described as a prophetess who the people of Israel came for judgment, and hence she plays the closest role to what we would think of as a judge. She calls for Barak to defeat Jabin, the king of Canaan. So starting out in chapter 4, we have again, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan, and Jabin had a commander whose name was Sisera. And together they cruelly oppressed Israel for 20 years. So Deborah was raised up as a judge, and in verse number 6, she summons Barak from Kadesh and tells him and commissions him to go and gather men, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and Zebulun, and they will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, and the Lord will give Sisera into Barak's hands. So Deborah the judge calls on Barak to be this military leader to defeat the king of Canaan. But something interesting happens here is that Barak seems kind of tentative. For he's told, I will give the king into your hand. And Barak says to Deborah, if you will go with me, I will go. So he wants the help of Deborah. If you go with me, then I will go. Then I will go. But if you will not, then I will not go. So he's hesitant and tentative. And because of this, and I guess this is, she could have been called a prophetess. This is one word she does prophesy. She hears from God to call Barak to say that the Lord's given the king into your hand. So he says, if you go with me, I'll go. If you will not go with me, I will not go. So she says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, because of his hesitancy and tentativeness, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So here we see another character. We had the left-handed guy from the right-handed tribe. We had a possible Canaanite warrior fighting for another God that saves Israel. Then we have Deborah, who's a prophetess that calls Barak to be a judge, to be a deliverer. Barak says, nah, I'm not going without you. He's a hesitant and tentative. So she says, okay, I'll go with you. But you're not going to get the glory for this. You're not going to be remembered for this. God's going to raise up a woman to take the glory over the man of Israel, showing what could show the weakness of the men in Israel at the time, that God would now raise up a woman in the place of this male deliverer to give victory to. So you can see where these judges, as one commentator described, God's delivering them, but they're getting the leaders they deserve. They're not getting a Joshua. They're not getting a Moses. God's delivering them, but He's not using the greatest people to do it. And they're getting the leaders they deserve. Basically, they didn't deserve good leaders. They didn't deserve strong leaders. God in His mercy delivered them, but they got the leaders they deserve. And that could speak a lot. But we won't go there. So I'll deliver you to the hand of a woman. So what happens is Barak calls out Zebulun, Naphtali, and Kadesh. 10,000 men went up. Deborah goes up with him. And they go against Sisera and his chariots. And they go down from Mount Tabor. And the Lord, verse number 15 says, the Lord routed Sisera and his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. So the commander of the Canaanite king, he escapes. But God does give the Israelites victory. And it says, all the army, verse 16 says, all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not a man was left. So yes, God does give Deborah and Barak victory over the army of Sisera. But Sisera flees, and he's on the run. And he goes into the tent of a woman named Jael. Now, Jael was the wife of Heber the Kenite. And he goes into this tent because he knows this family. He knows this house. Because there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. So there was peace between Jabin and Jael's family. So when Sisera's on the run, he goes into this friendly tent. And Jael came out and meets Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid. So she welcomes Sisera in. He turns aside, goes into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, stand at the opening of the tent. If any man comes and asks you, is anyone here, say no. So he's going to rest. He's got some nice warm milk, and he's going to lay down, and he's going to take a nap. But as he lays down to take a nap, verse 21 says, Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So Jael hammers his head to the ground with a tent peg. And then it has to add, I guess for those that don't get the hint, so he died. You think? And behold, Barak's still pursuing him at the time, but now this woman, Jael, has already done the job. She's done the job of killing Sisera. And Jael went out to meet Barak and said, come and I will show you the man who you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with the tent peg in his temple. And so that day God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people. And Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, and they destroyed Jabin, the king of Canaan. So another interesting story that has an unlikely hero that God raised up, Jael, in the place of a hesitant and tentative Barak who would not go out and fight on his own, even though the prophetess told him, God will deliver this army and this king into your hand. So, therefore, Jael gets the credit for the victory. Then when we go to chapter 5 is what is called the Song of Deborah. Technically it's the Song of Deborah and Barak, but it's commonly just referred to as the Song of Deborah. And it starts out in chapter 5, verse 1. Then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on this day. And basically they sing this song of victory, recounting what has happened and how God gave Israel the victory. And this is described by scholars and archaeologists as probably one of the oldest pieces of literature that we have that dates back to probably the 1100s. We don't have many full copies and fragments of anything, but what we do have, this is one that was known as the oldest piece of literature that we have from this time period. That was written really right after, what's happening here. Before the monarchy, before David, is what is written here. And there's even some figurative language. It kind of prefigures what we call apocalyptic language and apocalyptic literature. It starts out calling attention to the princes and the kings. Verse number 4 of chapter 5, Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled. So you have this imagery of God going to war and God fighting and the earth trembling and the heavens dropping and the mountains quaking. And all of that is symbolic language. And it's language that paints a picture of the greatness of God, the victory of God. We see this language more developed in the time of the prophets. Very similar language, even though this is way before apocalyptic language. But it's symbolic language, figurative language that paints a picture of what's going on. So that's why you see, God marching, even though God didn't literally come to Edom and march. But it describes God's victory over the enemies. It describes the earth trembling, the heavens dropping, the mountains quaking before the Lord. Verse number 6, again, it talks of references in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael. Deborah describes herself in verse 7 as a mother of Israel. It describes the war, the shield, the spears, those who ride on white donkeys in verse number 10, sit on rich carpets, the sound of musicians. So it's very poetic. It's very poetic. Verse number 12, awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, break out in song, arise, Barak, lead away your captives. Verse number 13, then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down for me against the mighty. And then they go on to list the tribes of Israel. It says, from Ephraim, their root, they marched down to the valley, following you, Benjamin, in verse 14. Zebulun is mentioned. Issachar is mentioned in verse 15, that came with Deborah. Reuben is mentioned in verse 15. Places like Gilead, Dan is mentioned in verse 17. Asher is mentioned. Zebulun again is mentioned. Naphtali again is mentioned. So you have the mentioning of the tribes that fought. Verse 19, you have the kings that came and fought the kings of Canaan. Verse 20 is described, from heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. So again, that's symbolic language. The stars literally didn't come down and fight, but the stars was a picture. If you go all the way back to Genesis and you go to the story of Joseph, remember Joseph saw the sun, the moon, and the stars. bowing down, and that was a picture of his mother and his father and his brothers. So the stars are pictures of the tribes of Israel. So you see the figurative language there. Verse 24, then you go down to verse 24 and it says, most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent. She sent her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Very descriptive. Between her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. Between her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. Poetic. Who knew something so gruesome could sound so beautiful when you put it in poetry? He sank, he fell, he lay still. Between her feet, he sank, he fell, dead. Yeah, because she nailed a tent peg right through his temple, and she nailed him to the ground with the blood all over him. But it sounds so beautiful and poetic in this song. So there just goes to show it's not what you say, it's how you say it that makes the difference. And then it goes on to describe his mother waiting for him to come back, and he's not coming back. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera wailed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Where's my baby boy? Yeah, he's nailed to the ground. Where he sank, he fell dead. Why is his chariot so long? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest princess answer, indeed, she answers herself, have they not found in the vide of the spoil the womb, a womb or two of every man, spoil of dyed materials for Sisera, spoil of dyed materials embroidered, 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for the neck of spoil. So may all, and then ends the song, verse 31, so may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as he rises in his might. And the land had rest for 40 years. Judges, we stay away from it, but man, there's some interesting stuff in Judges. So if you have a sense of humor, if you have a twisted sense of death poetry, it's all right here in the Song of Deborah. But the song is giving praise to God for the destruction of his enemies and how he saves them, how the tribes come together to help save, how Jael gets the glory, and this is how Jael gets the glory as well. Some are even reproached, some places are even reproached for not helping out here in the Song of Deborah. But the poem is celebratory in tone. It reinforces the victories that are taking place here. If only Israel could win a victory and stay faithful, but they can't gain a victory and stay faithful. Because when we get in chapter 6, we go right back into Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord.